Okay, so we're still sticking with the theme of genetics. Last time we talked about meiosis and how we divide these homologous chromosomes, and how then in meiosis 2 we divide sister chromatids, and we talked about how we're increasing all this genetic diversity through crossing over, through random fertilization. And so that directly ties into what we're going to be talking about today, which are inheritance patterns. And so when we're talking about inheritance, you're talking about the genes and the traits that you inherit from your parents. And so this is, again, directly tied into genetics. And so we're going to be learning lots of new phrases and words today. And we're going to learn some simple genetics. So first of all, let me just refresh your memory. So we're humans, right? We've got 46 chromosomes. We have this karyotype, which we discussed last time. This can be used to line up and pair up all of the homologous chromosomes with one another. And then in addition, you also have your sex chromosomes right here. And so that your chromosomes can be divided into two different kinds. Every human is going to have two sex chromosomes, right? So if you're female, you have XX, and if you're male, you have XY. And then all the other chromosomes, those are going to be called autosomes. And those are numbered chromosomes 1 through 22. So there's 22 pairs of autosomes, or in other words, 44 autosomal chromosomes. And then there's one pair of sex chromosomes, 2 individual chromosomes, an X and an X, or an X and a Y. And so because we have these homologous chromosomes, and because we inherit chromosomes and DNA from both of our parents, that means for every single gene, you're going to have 2 different possibilities. So if you have the same version of that gene on both chromosomes from the parents, then the offspring is going to look exactly like that. But you can have different versions of genes, like blonde hair, brown hair, blue eyes, green eyes. And so depending on what those 2 characteristics from each source are, that's going to determine what the offspring is going to look like. And so we're going to go through and we're going to talk about how to predict different ways and predict which kind of traits are going to be present in offspring. And so before we start doing this, we need to go over some vocab. And so when we're talking about genes, again, so we're talking about homologous chromosomes. So here's one chromosome and here's another one. So one from mom, one from dad, right? Same order of genes, just different versions of those genes. And those different versions of those genes are called alleles. So for each gene in our body, you have 2 different alleles. And depending on how those alleles are related to one another, that's going to determine what effect that gene is going to have on you. And so let's just say here's a chromosome or 2 homologous chromosomes. So let's just say right here that this is going to be the gene. Let's do hair color. All right? So if my mom has brown hair, and my dad has brown hair, then you better believe that I'm going to have brown hair, which is what happens. So does my brother. So my parents both had brown hair, so we're going to end up with brown hair. It's not that simple. That's kind of an oversimplification. But when we're looking at these 2 different alleles, we label them based on whether they are dominant or whether they are recessive. So in classic genetics, like we said, you're going to have 2 different alleles. They can both be dominant alleles, they can both be recessive alleles, or you can have one of each. And so what a dominant allele is, you have a dominant trait, that means that you only need one copy of one dominant allele to see the appropriate outcome, or to see the phenotype. The phenotype is what the result of your genes are. So our phenotype, my phenotype is I have brown hair, brown eyes, medium color skin, medium height. That's my phenotype. My genotype is the actual, what the genes are coding for, like which alleles they have. So the genotype is what determines your phenotype, or what you're going to look like. And so you can have these dominant alleles. So remember, homologous chromosomes, they're crossing over, they're going through meiosis, and then you end up with your gametes, right? And so depending on which gamete fertilizes which gamete, you're going to have different combinations of these alleles. And so in this example, if we're looking at brown hair color is dominant to blonde hair color. That's why a lot of people, that's why you see more brown-headed people than blonde-headed people. Same thing with redheads too. And so the reason why it's dominant is because, well, you only need that one copy of that allele, that dominant allele, to see the phenotype. So it doesn't matter what this other allele is, because as long as there's one, you're going to have brown hair. So with the way we write these genotypes, we label them based on capital and lowercase letters. So since brown is the dominant trait, the symbol for that dominant trait is going to be a capital B. So if it's capitalized, that means it's a dominant trait. If it's lowercase, that means it's a recessive trait. But they're going to be the same letter coding for the same trait. So in this case, because brown is dominant, we're going to use a capital B. And then to show recessive, we're going to take that same letter, except it's going to be lowercase. So this represents a dominant allele, and this represents a recessive allele. And a dominant allele, again, if you only get one copy of a dominant allele, you're automatically going to see the phenotype associated with that. So it doesn't matter what this other allele is, as long as you've got this capital B, you're going to have brown hair. Now, a recessive allele, on the other hand, you have to have two copies of a recessive allele to see the phenotype. So people with blonde hair have little b, little b. They have two recessive alleles. Because recessive means you're going to have more copies of whatever this allele is before you see the phenotype. Dominant just means that it's going to dominate over the recessive allele. So if you had a gene that was big B, little b, you're going to see the phenotype of the dominant allele over the recessive allele. The only way you're going to get that recessive trait, or that less common trait, is if you have two copies of them, like this. So, if we're taking, so let's just say we have, somebody with brown hair. So there's two different genotypes that can be represented by brown hair. So an individual with a big B, this is going to have brown hair. And so what this represents the allele from one homologous chromosome, and that represents the allele from the other homologous chromosome. And so these alleles are just versions of genes, right? In this case, we're talking about versions of hair color. And so this individual, this is going to be brown hair, because all you need is one copy of that big B to get the brown hair. What other genotype could be possible for having brown hair?
Capital B, little b.
Capital B, little b, right? So these are both going to produce brown hair because they both have at least one copy of the dominant allele. Yeah, Patrick?
Do you always put the dominant one first?
Yes, you always put the dominant one first. And you always name or symbolize the trait based on the dominant color. It just so happens that blonde and brown both start with B. But let's just say this was redhead, this would still be a lowercase b, because it's the lowercase version of the dominant allele.
So how do you actually read that? Dominant, recessive?
We're getting there. Okay, so here are our three options of alleles, right? You can have two dominant alleles, you can have one of each, or you can have two little ones. So if you have two alleles that are the same, so in other words, a big B, or a little b, we call those homozygous. Homo in Latin means the same. So they're the same as their partner. So they're both uppercase, or they're both lowercase. Now, if they're both uppercase, then we call that homozygous dominant. So it's dominant because it's showing the dominant phenotype. And so this guy right here, this is going to be the homozygous, I'm just going to abbreviate, homozygous dominant. What do you think this guy right here would be? Homozygous recessive, right? It's still homozygous because they're both the same. So this guy's going to be homozygous recessive. Recessive because we're talking about the recessive traits. Recessive. And so the guys in between, those that have one big B and one little b, heterozygous. Hetero means different. So these are going to be heterozygous.
So if it's two big letters or two big B's, then it would be
Homozygous dominant. And if it's two little b's, then it's going to be homozygous recessive. And if they're different, it's just going to be heterozygous. That means one big version, or one dominant allele and one recessive allele. And so the heterozygous, as long as because it has that one dominant allele, the heterozygous and the homozygous dominant are going to look the same. So, and one way that we can predict these inheritance patterns is through use of a Punnett square. And this Punnett square is it's a very simple way to predict certain phenotypes and genotypes of offspring. So if my parents, let's just say that my dad was a homozygous dominant for brown hair, and let's just say my mom was a heterozygous for brown hair. And so consider this, mom's alleles, and consider these dad's alleles. So consider this a sperm and consider this a sperm. Because remember, during meiosis, first we separate the homologous chromosomes, and then we separate the sister chromatids. And so those sister chromatids, you're only going to have one allele per chromatid. So anyways, when you set up this Punnett square, this is just like a mating. So a mating between a homozygous dominant for brown hair and between a female or with a female that's heterozygous for brown hair. So if you want to predict what the offspring are going to look like, all you do is you just match up everything. So this offspring is going to be big B, big B, so they're going to have brown hair, right? This one is going to be heterozygous, so it's also going to have brown hair. This guy is going to be big B, and then this guy will be big B, little b. So the offspring, and this is based on percentage, so you're going to have 50% that are going to be homozygous dominant, and 50% of your offspring are going to be heterozygous. So I don't know what my parents' genotype for hair is. I know they both have brown hair, so this could be a possibility, or we could have another possibility. So let's just say both my parents were heterozygous for brown hair. So as far as the offspring is concerned, this guy is going to be a big B, big B. This guy will be a big B, little b. This guy will be a big B, little b. And then this guy is going to be homozygous recessive. So in other words, you're going to have a 25% chance of having blonde hair in this case. But that's only going to happen if both parents were carrying one of those recessive alleles. Yeah?
What if the phenotype was, like, an example, my dad has sandy red hair and my mom has brown hair, but I have sandy brown hair?
I know that brown hair is dominant over blonde hair. I'm really not sure how red gets in there. I think it's obviously not very common, less common than blonde, so it's some sort of recessive type trait, but how the genetics of all of it work, I'm really not sure. It's not a blending though. It's not a blending thing that's happening. So both my parents can still have brown hair in both of these examples, but depending on the genotype, you can get different effects of the offspring. Whereas in this case, there's 0% chance of having a kid with brown hair. But here, you have a 25% chance of having a child with blonde hair. And you have a 75% chance of the child having brown hair. Does that kind of make sense a little bit? Okay, trust me, we're going to do lots of examples of these. Yeah, Nancy?
It's a little off of that, but if hair color is determined by your genetics, what causes your hair to change colors?
That's another question I don't know the answer to.
Right, nice have
Yeah, because
blonde hair than a-
kids, like babies, they'll have brown or blonde hair and then it'll change. I have no idea how that works. Same thing with dogs, they'll be born with like green eyes and then it'll change to like blue eyes. I don't know, it's something complicated and I don't know. It's known, I just don't know it, so all I'd have to do, look it up.
You think their hair color's that, and then all of a sudden it changes.
Yeah, and like I said, I have no idea. It's probably a pigment thing. I don't know. I'll look it up. Because everyone asks me, and I'm like, I don't
I had a
know.
blonde patch this summer, and I did not know where it came from.
Well, blonde patches, I mean, some of this can be influenced by the environment too. Because like I have kind of like red streaks.
I got green.
Green? Green? You swim in chlorine too much. But if you have sun can highlights, right? And so some of that, it's not because I was born with a mix of brown and red hair, it's just, so environment can affect the phenotype too, so.
But see, he was blonde until he was like 5 years old. He was white blonde, and now.
I'll look it up.
Dark
I'll
brown.
look it up.
No, it's not.
Yeah, Michelle?
No,
Oh, you don't have a question?
Sure, I was saying, if both my parents have brown hair, my brother has blonde hair, one of them's Karen, they both.
Both of them. So that, if your brother has blonde hair, then that's the parent, then both of your parents are heterozygous.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the only way you can get this blonde, is if both parents have a copy of that recessive trait.
Is that like eye color?
Eye color too,
So they both
yeah.
have brown eyes,
Mm-hmm.
but I have a green eye and a brown and a blue eye.
Okay. So it gets a little complicated. So I'm trying to stick to like examples that have only 2 alleles. So when you throw in a third one, it gets a little bit more complicated. But it's still based on this. It's based on the genotypes of your parents. Yes.
For the second Punnett screen here, so the 25% would be homo recessive.
Yes.
And then the 75% would be what?
Well, you would actually see, so you'd see 25% homozygous dominant, this guy right here, 50% heterozygous, and then 25% homozygous recessive. And so this is a ratio that is going to be observed in genetics. So whenever you have a heterozygous crossed to another heterozygous, you're always going to see this 25, 50, 25. So in other words, that's going to be a ratio of 1 to 2 to 1. That's going to be the genotypic ratio. That's based on the genotype of the alleles. Now, I'm also going to have a phenotypic ratio, meaning what the offspring are going to look like. What do you think that one is? If you have 75% brown and 25% blonde,
3 to 1, 3 to 1.
it's going to be a 3 to 1 phenotypic ratio. And so, again, you can have 2 totally different genotypes, like in this example, but have the same phenotype. And so you can have genotypic ratios and phenotypic ratios. Whenever you cross a heterozygous to a heterozygous, you're always going to get a 1 to 2 to 1 a genotypic ratio and a 3 to 1 phenotypic ratio. Y'all
So
still?
if you have 2 recessives, 2 parents that are both recessive, and they're only gonna throw out recessive.
Mm-hmm,
So
exactly.
does that mean then the children will only express recessive as well?
Yep. So if you have blonde hair, well, like blue eyes. If your parents have blue eyes, that means they're little b, little b. So if you have little b, little b, little b, little b, you're gonna end up with little b, little b. So it's the only way you can get blue eyes if both of your parents are homozygous. Well, it's not the only way, but it's the easy way to get blue eyes if both your parents are homozygous recessive. You can also get it in this case, so if this was eye color, and you had 2 heterozygotes, you'd still get a 25% chance. But to guarantee you have a blue-eyed child, you want to have blue eyes and then marry someone, have kids with somebody that has blue eyes. Okay, so we're okay so far? All right. Okay, so this is kind of what we've already talked about, the different nomenclature that's used to describe the different alleles.
Are we gonna talk about wild type or?
Yeah, sometimes, yeah, a little bit. Okay, so this is a Punnett square. This is what we just did over here. And the way that we were able to figure out all this stuff is by a scientist, actually he was a monk, named Gregor Mendel. And back in the 1800s, he did all these studies with pea plants. And this is before we knew what a gene was, this is before we knew of chromosomes. We knew there was something that was carrying our genetic information, but we didn't even know what DNA looked like. So he figured out all of these inheritance patterns just based on crossing peas together, all right? And so what he did, he took a heterozygous yellow pea, and yellow is going to be dominant to the green pea. I'm used to seeing green peas, but that's actually a recessive trait. So the dominant pea color is actually yellow. And so anyways, he's taking a heterozygous, so big Y, little y, and he's crossing that to another heterozygous, big Y, little y. And so you're going to end up, again, when you cross a heterozygous to a heterozygous, you're going to end up with this 3-to-1 genotypic ratio. In other words, 75% yellow and 25% green. And you're going to have this 1 to 2-to-1 genotypic ratio. So 25% homozygous dominant, 25% homozygous recessive, and then 50% heterozygous. So it's just what we talked about, it's just using a different trait. And so one thing I wanted to make sure y'all understand, when we're talking about the parent, you know, they're going to have 2 alleles, right? So we all have 2 alleles of each of our genes because we have 2 sources, right? One from mom, one from dad. And so you got to imagine, if this is the parent, imagine the alleles that you would get if this underwent meiosis. So 2 alleles will separate from one another during meiosis. So in other words, this is going to go into one gamete, and this is going to go into a different gamete. So these represent sperm and eggs right here. And so you can, well, this is sperm because this is the male down here. So once the male undergoes meiosis, the way you figure out what letters go here is you basically just put one of them here and one of them here. Because remember, these gametes, these are going to be